Welcome to Conversations Live. For more than a decade, we've brought you the best in books, entertainment, celebrity interviews, and current events. When the movers and shakers of the world have something to say to you, they say it to us first. Here's your host, Cyrus Webb.
Welcome back, everyone, to Conversations Live. I'm your host, Cyrus Webb. Glad you all could join us once again. For a radio audience tuning in at WYAD 94.1 FM and WYADonline.com, we're glad that you all can be with us. Also joining us online worldwide via our podcast at iHeartRadio and Amazon Music. We're glad you all could be with us as well. Well, I think all of us, especially since the movie Oppenheimer, have thought about the what-if scenarios that can happen when it comes to nuclear war. Where our next guest has written a book that not only looks at the scenario, but also kind of walks us through what that would look like, the impact, but also what all of us need to think about when it comes to nuclear arms. We're excited to welcome best-selling author Annie Jacobsen to our broadcast today. Her new book is called Nuclear War. It's already a bestseller on Amazon. We're going to talk to Annie not only about the writing and research of the book, but also what it was like for her to dive into the topic of nuclear warfare, what she wants readers to take away, and of course we'll let you guys know how to stay connected with her as well. Annie, thank you again for the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, Annie, I read this book with a lot of interest, and I have to tell you, parts of it were very difficult to read only because of, as I said in my intro, the what-if scenario that so many people think about. We see these movies sometimes, but you really literally walk us through, in some instances, minute by minute, what can happen if situations do occur that we find ourselves in nuclear warfare. What has it been like for you, Annie, through your research, to not only share what you've learned, but also to show the impact and consequences of nuclear warfare?
Well, thank you for reading so closely. And yes, I wanted to show the readers in horrific detail what nuclear war would be. And I take the reader from nuclear launch to nuclear winter. Having interviewed scores of high top-level presidential advisor nuclear command and control officers, I was able to get this inside look on how the ticking clock scenario actually unfolds. And, it was shocking at every turn, really, because, we have this idea that deterrence will hold, that is prevention. That's what I've always been told in all the other books I've reported on the Pentagon, on the CIA. And it was during the last administration, to answer your question about why I wrote this book, that, the fire and fury rhetoric that President Trump was having with the president of North Korea, I began to wonder, my God, what if deterrence fails? What if we actually had a nuclear launch? And that's why I began to report this book.
Well, I have to say, and again, the reason why I wanted to make sure I read it, Annie, is because I think a topic like this, it is so easy for us to, as you just said, to say, that these things can't happen, or what wouldn't happen, or if this did happen, it wouldn't affect us. You literally take us into, and what I thought was so powerful about this, and I want to ask you later about the impact of you even writing this, but what I thought was so fascinating is putting us into the mind and the decisions of the commander-in-chief, and how literally every second matters. Those that he listens to, the decisions he makes, realizing that lives can be lost. What was that like for you to kind of go through that tick-tock of thinking about not only the responsibility, but also the impact of those decisions?
So the President of the United States has what is called sole presidential authority. And that is a basic fact that most people really don't necessarily know. And when you break it down, it's exactly like it sounds. The president launches nuclear war. He asks permission of no one, not the Secretary of Defense, not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and not the Congress. And when you think about the idea of war powers, that, this is always a decision in a democracy by many people, with the exception being nuclear war. This is a shocking fact. And then we start there. And, it's just, it was learning when I was interviewing all these defense officials, it's just one piece of information after the next that's just impossible for your mind to comprehend. I'll give you another one, an ICBM, which is so that's an intercontinental ballistic missile, meaning it goes from one continent to the other continent in a really short period of time, like 30 minutes. It carries a nuclear warhead. An ICBM cannot be redirected or recalled. That is another basic fact. As you start to string these together, if you're me reporting it and now the reader reading it, you begin to realize why once nuclear war begins, it cannot be controlled, because it's a series of escalating sequences, essentially, that decision trees spawn off of that become even more complex and lead to the possibilities of a bigger and bigger and bigger nuclear exchange, and that is precisely what happens in the book.
Yeah. You take us into, which is why I want to get into the research of this, Annie, and in the chapter, the first 24 minutes, what you call the Decisions Handbook. I'd never heard of that, by the way. So, again, thank you again for so much of this that I think a lot of people will say, I didn't even know there was that. I think we've all heard about or seen in movies about the Black Book, right? But to be able to hear that title, the Decisions Handbook, I want to talk about the complicated nature of these decisions, because as you talk about in that chapter, the first 24 minutes, Annie, there's a whole thing about not only what targets to hit, but what type of weapons to use. And you even go, not to spoil it for those who haven't read it, but even showing that depending on how this were to occur, that there may not be a commander-in-chief as we know it at the time of a nuclear attack. What was that like for you to kind of get into that much detail of not only the decisions of making, the call of launching nuclear weapons, but also deciding what that would look like?
Well, you pointed out two important lanes of the narrative structure that I have to deal with. One, which was that idea of the sequence of events that once the president learns a nuclear missile is on its way, once we've gotten secondary confirmation from a ground radar system, and now the Pentagon officials are going to brief the president on what he needs to do for a counterattack. And you're absolutely right. The football gets opened, the Decisions Handbook comes out. It's also called the Black Book because it involves so much death. He has to give the counter launch. And at the same time, you have this second lane of action, which has to do with what's called continuity of government, that it's inherent in the Constitution that there must be a functioning government in the event of a war. And so for that, I interviewed Obama's former FEMA director, Craig Fugate, to take me through what it looks like as they're trying to set up in a bunker outside of Washington what might be the future government after nuclear war. And, this is all hypothetical. And then this is what Fugate said to me about planning for a nuclear war. He kind of cut through all the rhetoric and said, Annie, he explained to me that his agency, FEMA, plans for, hurricanes, floods, earthquakes. They even plan for asteroid strikes. He called nuclear war a low probability, high consequence event. And he said to me that in the event of nuclear war, there would be no population protection planning because everyone would be dead. And when you are working from that kind of a quote, and I go back to him and say, I just want to be really clear that this is precisely what you said to me. And he says, yes. You begin to realize this narrative I am writing, taking the reader from nuclear launch to nuclear winter, is actually getting worse and more existentially threatening by the second.
And I think that's why a book like this is so important. I referenced Oppenheimer in my intro, Annie, and of course that movie, I think, shed a light on this topic once again for a generation even that may not even have thought about nuclear war or the impact of it. There's a great quote that you have in the book. We may be likened to two scorpions in a bottle, Robert Oppenheimer once said of the arms race between the U.S. and Russia, each capable of killing the other, but only at the risk of his own life. We've heard a lot about, nuclear arsenal over especially the past several weeks even, right, when it comes to Russia, the fears of Russia getting close with China, what that means for us. Talk to us about what it's been like for you since the book was released, Annie, to see the renewed interest in this topic and people's fascination with this scenario as you outlined it in the book.
When I was reporting this book, a lot of it during COVID, I had sources, people like former secretaries of defense, former nuclear subforce commander, going on the record with me in June in an interesting time because a lot of us were less busy than we usually be, and certainly the Cold War warriors I was interviewing. And that was only a few years ago, and the nuclear threat seemed to have faded into the distance. It was one of the reasons that a lot of these individuals spoke to me. Former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta said, that he was concerned people had forgotten about how dangerous weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons are. And here we find ourselves just a few years later with people like Vladimir Putin threatening to use WMD on the battlefield. Kim Jong-un recently accused the United States of having a sinister intention to provoke nuclear war. Those were his words. This is very dangerous. Nuclear saber rattling is incredibly dangerous. Anyone will tell you that. Read my book. You will see that all of this needs to be a situation where we all come back from the brink, because once nuclear war begins, it doesn't end until 5 billion people are dead.
You are no stranger to reporting, Annie, but I couldn't help but wonder in reading this book, especially, and the last part of the book is brilliant. The way you end this book is brilliant. But how difficult was it for you to let go of this? Or have you been able to let go of it since you've written it and now, of course, having to have conversations like this about it? Was it an easy topic for you to let go of?
What an interesting question. Of course, what you write and report impacts you, but it's different because the process is, as you are writing it, you are very impacted. When you are learning about nuclear winter, as I was, from one of the actual living authors of that original paper, Carl Sagan. It was written by 5 people, including Carl Sagan in the 80s. Professor Brian Toon was the youngest author on the paper. He's still alive. He spent decades working on this issue. He recently worked on a paper for Nature Foods, updating all that nuclear winter data using computer models that show nuclear winter. And this is where, agriculture fails because the sunlight gets blotted out from the soot lofted into the air from the nuclear megafires. Learning about this stuff in real time, to answer your question, was pretty, stomach churning. And at the same time, I think my job as a reporter is, the old adage, just the facts, ma'am. You write the facts for the people, because nuclear weapons are a man-made problem, and therefore they have a man-made solution. This is not an asteroid strike. This is not an asteroid hurtling towards the world that there's nothing we can do about. We can move toward disarmament.
I was going to ask you a question, but I'm not going to put you on the spot like that, so I'm not going to ask that question. But I do. I'll turn the question around.
Ask me the question.
Well,
ask me the question.
Well, okay. Well, we can turn it around, but do you think we have the humility to do it?
Okay, great. I'm so glad you asked that question. Yes, and let me tell you why. Because humility, I think, and this is just me as a human, right? If you're going to really summon the humility inside of you, in essence, it means a little bit saying to yourself, I might have been wrong about my thinking. That's what I would say. That's what humility is to me. And I'm going to use President Reagan as an example here, and it's pretty much the only hopeful note I can leave you on, which is what I learned while reporting the book. Back in the 80s, when I was in high school, there was an ABC TV movie called The Day After, which showed a nuclear war between then Soviet Russia and the United States. It was terrifying. 100 million people, Americans, watched that film. And so did President Reagan. And Reagan, before seeing that film, was a nuclear hawk. He believed that more nuclear weapons made America safer. He was all about nuclear supremacy. He saw the movie. By the way, his chief of staff didn't want him to watch it. He saw the movie, and he wrote in his White House journal that he became greatly depressed. And as a result, he had what I believe you are saying is humility. He reached out to Gorbachev. Like, Russia was the arch enemy at the time. And instead, Reagan found it in himself to see Russia as an adversary or as an opponent, which requires humility. He reached out to Gorbachev, and as a result, they had the Reykjavik summit. And in 1986, we were at an all-time high of nuclear weapons. There were 70,000 of them. And because of the Reykjavik summit, it got this movement moving toward disarmament, where you reduce the arsenals because they're just too dangerous. They're an accident waiting to happen. Today, we have approximately 12,500 nuclear weapons among the 9 nuclear-armed nations. That is a movement in the right direction, and I believe it began, to answer your question, with Reagan's humility.
Love that. Love that. Well, I'm an optimist, Annie, and I have to say the book, the reporting is fascinating, and I think definitely worth the attention of our audience. Again, everyone, Nuclear War Scenario is the book. Annie Jacobsen is the best-selling author of the book. Definitely make sure you guys pick it up. You can get it through our friends at Amazon.com or through your favorite local bookstore. Annie, I really appreciate this time with you. How can our audience stay connected with you?
You know, they can read my book at bookstores everywhere, and I have a website, AnnieJacobsen.com.
All right. We'll make sure that we link that up for our audience. Annie, thank you again. Really appreciate it, and looking forward to our next chat together.
Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, glad to do it. And we thank your audience for tuning in to another great segment of Conversations Live. Until next time, I'm your host, Cyrus Webb, saying as always, enjoy your day, enjoy your life, enjoy your world. Thank you all for choosing Conversations Live. Then let's go make today amazing. Take care.